Hello, everyone. JD here. This presentation is about media, so let's get started. Identify the mediums through which news is consumed by people, examine the transition that occurred in the newspaper industry, explain how the product of news is created by trained professionals, and discuss how technological changes have affected the ways that we access and distribute information from news media outlets. Here are 4 quotes that I'd like you to spend some time thinking about. I'm not going to talk about them in this presentation, but they definitely merit your attention. Marshall McLuhan, Ted Koppel, Thomas Griffith, and Malcolm X. Right? Development of the news business. The economics of early newspapers. Colonial times. No one earned a living solely by publishing the news. Most were run by people in related businesses, for example, print shop owners. They ventured into the news business because their marginal printing and delivery costs made newspaper publishing a viable sideline. It's an expensive undertaking. Wasn't unusual to feature breaking news that occurred 2 months earlier. So think about this. You got to collect all the information in one place, then you have to be able to publish, and after you do that, you got to distribute these newspapers to the public. This is very early on in terms of the development of the industry, so the technology really isn't there, right? You can create a newspaper, but it's going to take far more time, and it's more laborious, more technical even. It says here, took vast amounts of time and effort. Single impression on paper with wooden hand crank press. 13 steps. I want to add that in here. 13 steps. Every page had to be composed in reverse from individual pieces of metal type. Best printers of the day could print only 240 impressions per hour. And by the mid-1770s, approximately 25 weekly newspapers were serving the colonies. Almost immediately, the parties launched newspapers wherever they competed in order to advance their particular vision. In other words, partisan news. I want to tell you this. There's a perception in the year 2023-24, whenever you're listening to this, whether it's in the fall or the spring semester, right? The media is biased. Some sources are more to the left or liberal, or some sources are more to the right, conservative. Yes, I will say that when you look at the media bias chart, which I'm going to provide to everyone in the announcement feed, you can see for yourself where they fall in relation to one another. As human beings, we're flawed. We have our biases, which means perfect objectivity might be damn near impossible to achieve. Having said that, we have professional norms in the year 2023-24 that guide journalists' behavior when it comes to the work they're doing. And this is a major contrast to what has existed historically, because these early newspapers were essentially extensions of the parties themselves, which means you're only going to get biased information. There's really no attempt to be fair to different people, because the paper exists so that you can spread your distinctive message, right? Objective reporting had little place in these partisan organs. Pages advocated party platforms, promoted candidates, and attacked the opposition. These sponsored newspapers didn't attract large audiences. It's going to be a small handful of people, relatively small. What I want to say is this. During the first few decades of the Republic, the number of subscribers held steady at approximately 4,000, most of whom were likely voters already committed to a party. So this is not many people. Publishers came to serve as agents of the party politicians who hired and fired them. Readers were more or less incidental to this relationship, except that publishers needed sufficient numbers of subscribers to justify the party's financial support. And lastly here, knew if their papers lacked sufficient partisan fervor, their sponsor might withdraw its subsidy, championed their party as if their survival depended on it, because it did. You've got to move people emotionally so that they're inclined to want to purchase, read, so forth. If you can't stir people up a bit, or shall I say stir up people a bit, then there's a likelihood that your endeavor would fail, your paper would fail. Rise of the penny press. Liberation from party subsidies began in the 1830s with the adaptation of steam-powered printing and development of faster, more reliable cylinder presses. Technologies introduced dramatic economies of scale. You could sell more papers cheaply, increase their audience, and they could also split away from party sponsorship. I'm going to talk a bit more about what's going to make that possible, help make that possible. New York Sun, first paper to enlist new technology, but not until several years later, when the New York Herald hit newsstands, was the full potential realized. I also want to say this too. The Sun joined with several dozen other papers to create the Associated Press, or what's also known as AP. Remains the dominant wire service today and is increasingly enlisted as newspapers cut back. So AP, you can still go online and find AP stories. I read them, I would say, a bunch a year, perhaps. Herald sold for a penny. Readership twice that of the nearest competitor. Advertising revenue soared. That's part of what's going to make this possible, because you sell ad space to businesses that want to sell a product or service. Expanded news to include human interest stories, crime, business, and social events. You want to broaden the appeal. And think about this. If you really want more people to read your paper, then you're going to have to think about your business model. You're going to have to think about the content. And the partisan approach, probably you're not going to be able to maximize the number of readers and subscribers with that, because if people don't agree with your views, they're probably not going to read your paper, whatever you're sharing, right? They're not interested. So editors muted their partisan affiliations to appeal to a broader audience, and competition for mass readership became even more intense at the end of the 19th century. Screaming headlines and sensational stories, which critics derided these papers as yellow journalism. How many newspapers are near you? The U.S. lost more than a fourth of its newspapers since 2005, leaving 70 million residents with no local news outlet, or one at risk, with only a single outlet and limited access to critical news, according to a report by the Northwestern University's Medical School. So you have no newspapers, one newspaper, two or more newspapers. Major cities typically have two or more. But sometimes major cities don't. When I lived in Houston, we had the Houston Chronicle. Not the only media outlet, but that's the major newspaper. I grew up outside of Chicago. We had the Sun-Times and the Tribune. And then we also had newspapers in the suburbs, because Chicago is the nation's third most populated city, and the suburbs are pretty extensive. All right. So I just want to mention that. If you're in rural areas, it's more difficult to come by. And I will say, I want to add this in there, that people need newspapers, or at least some news outlet, to learn about what's going on with their school board or their school system, with their county board or their city council or whatever. There's lots going on in community, any given community, that unless you're going and reading the meeting minutes from the actual government itself, which many people don't do, you probably want to keep up on what's happening. It's going to be people talking about a tax increase, any issue, or like a referendum. When I lived in Illinois and I taught there was a referendum in the school district where I worked to build a new high school. Well, information about that referendum is going to end up in the newspaper. This is where people learn. And when we have election cycles, you can go and learn about candidates by reading stories. The point I'm trying to make is having access to some kind of source is going to be very, very important, especially in these smaller communities, because these smaller markets, information doesn't make its way around as easily. unless, of course, you're going and checking the government sites. But then people have to dig through PDF files. They often don't want to do that. Okay, moving on. Emergence of radio and television. So newspapers have been struggling over the last, couple, I would say 25 years, 25 years. In 1920, Westinghouse launched the first commercial radio station, KDKA. Within a few years, 500 stations were broadcasting to an audience of 2 million. I got to turn this over. And I do want to say this. KDKA was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. By 1930, just over 40% of households owned radios. There was a concern. Might this eclipse the newspaper? So is the new technology, which is obviously going to be exciting to people, is that going to somehow mean the end of newspapers because people have a different place to go for information? Well, it didn't. It didn't lead to that. First decade, most radio news consisted of brief, on-the-hour announcements, which newspapers welcome this because a story can be a lot longer than what could actually be in this on-the-hour announcement. If it's short, because they have to get in a handful of detail, what's going on, what's happening locally. Here are a few bits and pieces. I mean, really, when I think about that, it's not going to be the stories are not going to be very developed. But the newspaper will have longer content for people to consume more if they are interested. Franklin Delano Roosevelt used radio communication during his presidency, delivered 30 fireside chats on the radio, kept the public informed about the war's progress. I want to say this. There are documents in Roosevelt's files. They indicate 79% of all households heard the president discuss Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. People were tuning in to hear what he had to say about these issues. Plus, you think about what's going on with the Great Depression. It's a way of putting the public at ease. A lot of people own radios. You can communicate directly to them. Now, people might think, well, radio seems kind of antiquated. Yeah, it's been around a long time. We've been able to experience the internet. Well, the radio is that hot technology 100 years ago, right? Today remains a significant yet distinctly secondary source. There is a niche, though, for radio. It's talk radio, specifically syndicated call-in programs with conservative slant on public affairs. That's still popular among some people out there. 1950s witnessed astonishing growth as public embraced TV as essential home appliance. Audience exploded from 6 million to 60 million viewers, about 88% of households. The major networks are ABC, CBS, NBC. They dominated audience shares and news programming. And I would say ABC, CBS, and NBC are going to hold on at least until, well, I would say the 1980s, because once we finally get cable, that changed the game. And then eventually you see networks coming in like CNN, where you have like this 24-hour news cycle. Now, I don't know exactly how CNN operated at the very beginning, but I can tell you this. Nowadays, if you turn on, you can just do channel surf and you can see, and they're broadcasting some program all day long. So what I'm getting at here is the major networks, I think to some extent there's been a shift because people aren't getting information from them nearly as much, especially with the advent of, the internet, or at least making the internet more widely available to more people. And then we have smartphones. It really did change. Okay, I want to throw this in here. Era of network anchors as national celebrities. For example, Walter Cronkite, Nightly Evening News Network became the chief source. And this is because they projected objectivity and authority. I will say this. I don't remember Walter Cronkite, but I did watch, like Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings. Tom Brokaw was on NBC. Peter Jennings was on ABC. And then we had Ted Koppel, who did Nightline on ABC. There are people that I do remember growing up with because I remember before the internet was widely available to all of us. I mean, the technology existed, but it's not until the 90s that it really takes off. And it's not until the late 90s that people actually, whether it be people in office or people running for office, or a lot of organizations are developing websites. So it took several years there, because I remember email took off about 1992, the year I graduated from high school. But the internet's not really going to become, I would say, more of what we understand it to be until maybe around 95, give or take. Because I remember I lived with my college roommate Steve, and he had his computer he brought to campus, and he was doing IRC, internet related chat, doing that. And there were some websites, but I can honestly tell you, I think back to being in college, the number of websites, far fewer than what we have today. And the internet was pretty clunky back then. Of course, you also used dial-up connection and so forth, but that's all I want to say about that for the time being, because we want to stay focused here on the TV for the time being. All right. So market dominance is never permanent. Cable and satellite would take away a large chunk of the market share. Yes, cable and satellite will change the game considerably. I remember when we first got that in the early 80s. Then we moved, and then we stopped. My parents didn't get us cable subscription again. We're just back to network TV, which it's fine when you never have it, because when you go from just a handful of stations to like dozens of stations, back to a handful of stations as a kid, that's kind of frustrating. All right, so I want to add this too. By 2000, share of TV households just short of 90%. Today, the number has fallen to about 78%. I think it has a bit to do with streaming. Right. Digital revolution, let's get into this. Internet and mobile. In 1969, the first message between remote computers was sent from UCLA computer science professor Leonard Kleinrock's lab in, I think it's Boulter Hall, to Douglas Engelbart's lab at the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California. Decade later, protocols to link multiple networks together were standardized, and a concept of World Wide Web of computers was introduced. Early 90s, internet service providers began to emerge, and by 1995, the internet was fully commercialized. Yes, that is correct on the date there. What's interesting, too, we say commercialized. This is the internet becomes a private good, or a private good becomes a public good, I should say. Let's phrase it like that. Access would take coordination among government agencies, research scientists, and the business community. Early days, access World Wide Web from computers connected to the internet through analog telephone lines. The transmission of data accomplished using a device called a modem. It was very, very slow. I remember that. And also, if you're using your phone line, that means you can't take any calls, because this is before, back before we had, the cell phones existed. I remember cell phones existing in the late 80s. However, they don't become widely available until like the 2000s, really. And when I think back to the dial-up connection, when you got to go plug in to get on the internet, you can't take regular phone calls, at least not initially. There might have been some technology that changed. I can't remember exactly, but I do know this. You'd be on the internet. Well, that means you're taking up your phone line, which might upset people if they're expecting a call. A group of engineers and business people came together to solve a collective action problem facing the industry. If enterprises were going to leverage the connectivity of the World Wide Web, they had to make devices that could connect to the internet and connect to one another from anywhere. Mobile networks are what made this possible. By 2001, Americans were able to read their email and surf the web on mobile phones. Digital news changed the industry for newspapers. I will say this. Newspapers have been in decline for quite some time, and I say this, I feel a little melancholy about this. I mean, it's inevitable. The world's going to change. But I grew up delivering newspapers in the early 1980s. I had a paper route like 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago. And that was like my first real job. They would drop off the newspapers at our house, and I had to rubber band them up. And if it was raining, if it was snowing, I had to put them each in plastic bags. And I had this actual larger bag to put all the newspapers in. I had to walk house to house. And then people wanted it on their front step. And if it blew off their front step, they call and complain. Then I had to go around and collect the money. I had punch cards on a ring. And I had to go house to house to collect all the money on a monthly basis, and then punch the card and collect all the money and then turn it into the newspaper company. Yes, I remember this well. Well, those days have come and gone. I mean, the newspapers are still out there, and I occasionally will read a print version, but a lot of what I read is online. That's where it's all gone. Certainly since early 2000s, there's been a lot of change in this, and we've seen major newspapers actually go out of business. They've failed because it's difficult to make that transition. And when you talk about issues like paywalls, people don't always want to pay for content when they can find it free somewhere else. I mean, I'm going to be the first one to admit it. I do pay for a subscription to the New York Times. I do read other sites that the news is I can access for free as well. I mean, I read the New York Times, but I also read other sources because sometimes, you go on Google News and you'll see a lead story and you'll click on it and you'll go right to it and then you can actually read it. You have access. It's not behind a paywall. So, and let's be honest, we can't pay for a subscription to every source. It just isn't possible. I subscribe to New York Times and Foreign Affairs, and then I make an occasional donation to KUNR, the NPR affiliate out of the University of Nevada, Reno. All right. So digital news changing industry for newspapers, radio. We have podcasts, news provision and consumption, and television. We have streaming. So the podcast, which is great because then you can listen to it whenever you'd like, not just when they do a broadcast. So podcasts, I think, really did change the game. I don't know about you, but I love podcasts. In the morning, I'm listening to Morning Edition on KUNR. And then there's other programs, but I'll just leave it at that. With television, then, of course, we got streaming. And this has changed dramatically as well, all through the internet, right? Remember the old days of black and white TV with the rabbit ears? We have to adjust them just to get the signal. Technology has also provided a platform for politicians and those who are not reporters to insert themselves directly into the news cycle. Sure, if you have access to the internet, you can contribute to the public discourse. Mechanisms, we got blogs that are often done through websites or website builders such as GoDaddy, Wix, Squarespace. Those are the more popular ones these days. We also have Facebook, aka Meta, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat. Then you got Twitch. Probably ought to put YouTube on there. You people having YouTube channels, so forth. But what's interesting is you can put the content out there yourself. You don't have to have it filtered through someone else. In other words, think about it. Historically, and it's not that people in government, whether it be elected officials or otherwise, it's not that they never talk to media anymore. They certainly do. But if you want to get the information out there exactly how you like it, or you want it phrased, let's say, then you can publish it on the internet yourself, which really did change the game. And we got a lot of great content out there. I don't know if you've noticed, but there are a lot of great podcasts. There are a lot of really great YouTube channels, so forth. All right. Efforts blur the line between reporting and opinions. It's possible for people to get confused. This is part of the challenge I have too. When I'm in mixed company, I'm talking to people, I often like to ask them, where did you get that information from? And then they'll tell me, and I'll be like, well, actually, that's a commentary program. There's a difference between news and commentary. News is the facts, commentary is the opinions, right? And a lot of times people, they don't really know the difference. I notice this as a teacher, as someone who's interested in this discipline, but also interested in media in general, because I like to read a variety of different sources. It's interesting to me because people get confused, or people are not necessarily aware of the difference, at least what some programs are, just by the way they're designed. All right. Large majority of Americans get news on digital devices. This is going to change over time. I used to have other tables that I had in presentations past. I like to change out the data, and obviously data gets updated. But I remember looking at some, it was about like election information, where people get their sources from, or where people get their information from, which sources they use. Let's phrase it like that. The sources they're going to rely upon. So anyway, people like my parents, like my dad's in his 80s, my mom's in her late 70s, they turn to the television and occasionally the internet, but largely the television. I'm Gen X. I used to get information from both, but now I think I've switched over and I'm largely electronic, internet. I don't really watch any TV anymore. Hardly any, especially when there's so much content that you can get through the internet. But what I'm saying is, and the reason I bring it up, is there's like a generational shift. Eventually, I don't think that TVs are going to be, at least people seeking that out as a source of news. That's not going to be what it once was, at least for my parents' generation, because I'm already drifting away from that. Okay? So this is some data. Roughly half of Americans prefer to get news on digital platform. About a third prefer TV. All right? I think digital platforms is going to continue to rise. Those under 50 turn more frequently to digital devices for news. Exactly. And this is the point I'm trying to make. You compare that to my parents. The hot technology of their earlier life, television. Right? Percentage of adults who get their news often from a smartphone, computer or tablet, television, radio, print sources. Look at the difference between the 18 to 29 versus the 65 plus. That's a considerable gap. And then over here, since 2014, 2015, TikTok has arisen. Facebook usage has dropped. Instagram, Snapchat have grown. And you know what's interesting? I just saw a story not that long ago about Tumblr coming back into the fold. I remember when Tumblr was popular back in around the early 2010s. I read that it's coming back. It's making a comeback among younger people. Okay. Legacy news as a consumer product. Producers, reporters, and their news organizations. There's what's called the beat. Legacy newspapers and broadcast media cover the regular sources of important stories systematically by permanently assigning reporters to certain venues. For example, the White House. Reporters receive much of their information at the daily briefings conducted by the president's press secretary. I'm referring specifically to the White House here. Right? So just to read it again, legacy newspapers and broadcast media cover the regular sources of important stories systematically by permanently assigning reporters to certain venues. There you go. I also want to say this too, before I move on. Nearly all government agencies and senior officials have press staffs responsible for providing media with information. Agents who initiate news by issuing a statement. When you say the staff, who are these people? The staff, they're the agents who initiate news by issuing a statement. When you put out a press release, that's like putting bait in the water for fish. Okay? Right? So it's like drawing them in. People are like, oh, and I can also tell you this. I don't have a lot of experience on the government side of this. I mean, I know a bit about institutions, but I've done a lot of advocacy work in my earlier life. And I have written press releases, I have sent them out to media outlets, and then I've done interviews with various, reporters who show up, whether it's TV, radio, newspaper. Okay. And it's essentially your way of attracting, getting them out there. You write the press release in such a way that it's going to make them like, okay, an assignment editor might hear about it, read it, and say, oh, let's get a reporter out there. Important implications for news. Reporters routinely file stories or updates, remain close in case something happens, of course. I mean, I've seen this before. When I did watch TV, and actually when you watch some of these YouTube clips, you'll see reporters actually out there by the White House. Well, typically they're waiting there for the latest developments to occur so that they can report on them, and that's what they do. That's their work. Allow a news organization to work efficiently because agents specialize in particular sectors. Rival publications write about the same events. Now, the author of the text I wrote this from indicates they're more colleagues than competitors. I don't know about that because they're all businesses and you want to get the story out first. So that sounds to me like you're a competitor with all the other outlets, but that's just me thinking out loud here. Social dynamics create a conspicuously narrow or skewed representation of an event. I could see that. Because think about it like this, we're relying on these reporters to tell us what happened. Whether it's one or a handful of people, it's still one or a handful of people who are going to inform, theoretically millions. Reporting. Increased competition has given rise to many forms of news programming and presentation. And principles. Journalism. Discipline of verification. Practitioners maintain independence from those they cover. This is all about integrity and ethics. And remember, your credibility is all you've really got in some businesses. If you sacrifice it, well, your reputation as either an individual or as a news organization will be severely harmed. Okay, selecting the news. First criterion is the authority and status of the source and the importance of the story. So, in descending order, President, Senate, House of Representatives. That's descending order. President, Senate, House of Representatives. Not everyone is equally important in terms of what might come out of their office. Right? Second criterion is its level of controversy, the conflict, disagreement, preferable to consensus. Journalists sell stories to editors, and news organizations compete with one another, I think that this information here can be tied back to the previous slide, talk about this. Yeah, there are businesses that are looking to make money. So you want to have the story before everyone else. That sounds like competition to me. And remember, reporters got to make pitches to their editors. This is actually worth covering. This is worth covering. Third criterion, closely related to the second, is negativity. Bad news is dramatic. Okay, so it says here, media don't serve as strictly neutral conduit for the flow of civic info or information to their intended audience. When you consider the second and third criterion here, what it takes to get people's attention, but what might be motivating them. What might be motivating them? There we go. That needs to be taken into consideration here. News as a product of politics. Most political news doesn't claim to report only events. Most come from interviews, press conferences, and news releases. This is referred to as political talk, which assumes many forms, from official declarations to off-the-record conversations. This is important to political success. It's about putting the information out there to circulate. I'll tell you this. This seems like an interesting story here. When I worked in Houston, I'm not going to name any names because that would be unprofessional, but I had a colleague in Houston who told me once that he intentionally shared information with certain people in the office, knowing that those people would turn around and tell other people who would tell other people who would tell other people, and the information would make its way around to the person he really wanted to know what he was thinking about. I know it sounds very immature, but the reason why I bring it up is this. You put information out there because you want to have some kind of an impact on the direction the political discourse takes, or the public discourse, right? So it's not that you're just waiting for people to come to you. You're going to go out there to try to, I think, provide information that impacts the way people think about any given issue, or your position on the issue, or the work you're doing on that issue. Right? But it's political talk. Political news doesn't spring forth as a product of a single actor or set of collaborators. That makes sense. Joint product of independent actors competing with one another to define the story. Say independent actors, talking about politicians and news media. If there's human beings involved, they're going to sculpt it somehow. As they engage each other in the enterprise of newsmaking, they do so to achieve different and incompatible goals. Politicians seek the most favorable light. Business of news must keep an eye on their audience's interest. Well, yeah, and there's also investigative pieces that are done by media outlets. Those investigative pieces, those stories they run, might very well be embarrassing to government officials, right? And remember, public officials want you to think the best of them, which means they're going to be selective about what they share and how they frame it because they're trying to impact public opinion on some level. All right. One venerable news strategy is trial balloon. A politician floats a policy or idea with a reporter on the condition that the source remains anonymous. Another strategy is a news leak, giving consequential information to the news media on the condition that its source not be identified by name. You want it to circulate out there. This comes back to what I was talking about, the colleague of mine who wanted information to make its way around the office. Okay. How legacy news is produced. Content informed. Sensationalism. Give citizens what they want, which may be very different from what they need. I mean, let's be honest. This is a business. Clicks and views are important, especially when we're talking about online sources, right? That's the future, so that's the example I'm going with. So if clicks and views are important, it's possible that what is actually presented to the public might pique their interest, but isn't necessarily the best for them. Slant of the news and controversy or intrigue, all of which help grab people's attention because you have to, and there's so many outlets competing with one another. Speed. Many outlets rush the news, running stories that need to be corrected or just wrong. And this is where it's important to point out tension between reporters, editors, and producers. They're going to experience that. They feel while reporting illustrates an often incompatibility of trying to be the first and right. Because if the goal is to get the information out there before any of your competitors, it's entirely possible that you'll be mistaken about some of the facts if you move too quickly. News programming has adjusted to gain audiences. There's also what we refer to as infotainment. Daily Show is an example of that. Soft news. However, it can prove to be highly informative. It can. Let's see here. Americans' trust in mass media, 1972 to 2022. You can see it's come. The percent, great deal, fair amount has come down quite a bit from mid to high 60s or somewhere between 65 and 70, somewhere in the ballpark, down to 38 between the early mid 70s and 2022. Partisan trust in mass media, 1972 to 2022. Percent of great deal, a fair amount of trust and confidence in the mass media to report news fully, accurately, and fairly. This is by Republican, Independent, and Democrat. Here's the political cartoon. This is really, really good if you think about what's a good example of confirmation bias. We cherry pick information that reflects what we already believe. Right? Limits on media. Prior restraint. When a government seeks to prevent the publication or dissemination of written and recorded speech. The Pentagon Papers. I want to add this. Pentagon Papers was the U.S. decisions and information about the Vietnam War. It wasn't flattering because we weren't making the progress that elected officials claimed. Now, the Nixon administration won an injunction against the publication in district court. Under the argument that publication would undermine national security. Supreme Court emphasized government had to demonstrate it failed to do so. So you have the Supreme Court ruling against the lower court. In other words, you got to be able to show us that it's somehow threatening. And when you can't do that, well then, I'm sorry, you can't keep this information from being published because people deserve to know. Supreme Court came down against the Nixon administration. Then there's slander and libel. Public figures largely forfeit legal recourse to protect their reputation. Not only must injured individuals prove that their story was false, they must also prove the news producer acted with malice by publishing a damaging story it knew to be false, which is more difficult to do. I mean, you might be able to demonstrate. Well, let's put it this way. I'm going to rephrase. If there's misinformation, it's just flat out wrong, that is potentially Well, at least it's much easier to demonstrate. But the latter part of this, that's very difficult. When you say, prove the news producer acted with malice. That's a pretty high standard. Raises bar of proof so high politicians and other figures stand little chance of winning. Right? Demand for and effects of news. Where people get their news. I'm trying to flip through my notes here real quickly. And we're getting there. We're almost to the end. Bear with me. Nearly every household has a radio, TV, and one mobile connected device. Many people don't understand operations of government or topical matters. I can tell you that. Many are not interested in politics or what is happening in Washington, their state capital, or town hall. They don't know, and they're not particularly invested. How media influences citizens. Agenda setting and priming. Readers and watchers of news were influenced by what the press covered in a specific way. It shaped what they thought about, not what they thought. So what they thought about is the agenda-setting primer component, and not what they thought. That's persuasion. That's the persuasive side of this. Agenda setting, related to issues and topics, relate to the criteria with which we evaluate candidates or elected leaders. You don't have to change people's minds to change the decisions they make. I want to add this. Issues that rise, this is for a better definition of agenda setting. Issues that rise onto the agenda and dominate the news affect public perceptions of candidates and officials. Oh, no. Yeah. Okay, there we go. That's the priming part. I'm looking, there's two components. There's an additional piece I want to add in here too. So, talk about priming. Issues that rise onto the agenda and dominate news affect public perception of candidates and officials. This is called priming. Okay. There's also a term that doesn't appear on the slide, but I want to add it here. I just want to share it. Is framing. Media chooses a particular slant. That's also known as framing. Defines nature of the problem, organizes potential solutions, and wipes out alternative policies. I took this from Marone and Kesh, 2018. Okay. Last slide here. Political polarization. One might think the profusion of news across the spectrum would result in a better informed citizenry that's more tolerant and sophisticated. Neither result is necessarily true. Multitude of news choices allows consumers to avoid information that contradicts with their beliefs. There's often referred to this as, and it's not my term, Teresa Amato came up with this ideological cul-de-sac. And this is where I think it's important to consider confirmation bias. Are we just cherry picking information to reaffirm what we already believe? Or, okay. It's possible, and I know that people are known to do this. Little evidence that the increase in polarization is being shaped by social media has increased most among demographic groups least likely to use the internet and social media. Okay, that is where we're going to end. Thank you for listening. Peace.